This is one of a series of Good Answers presentations, offering evidence to answer skeptical challenges to the Bible's accuracy. We often hear today that religion and science are simply two different ways of looking at things, and that they are each valid in their own place. One deals with spiritual matters, while the other explores the physical world. Of course, that idea works only so long as neither one impinges on the other. But we all know that they can't be kept separate. For example, the Bible makes many factual claims about geography, history, plant and animal life, and more. All of these overlap with the world of science. And what if they contradict one another? The claims of one or the other, then, must be wrong. And in such a case, our present society will immediately tell us that the Bible must give way to science. It should stay with spiritual truth and let science tell us about reality. Science, in the form of Darwin's landmark work on the origin of species, challenged the first chapter of Genesis. The rich variety of the plant and animal world was not the work of a creator, but of evolution, a wholly natural process. Many Christians thereupon felt required to find ways of reading the creation account to accommodate Darwinian evolution. But was that necessary? Has evolution graduated now from the status of theory to become simple historical fact? If so, then the issue's settled. The media say it is. The schools say it is. For almost a century now, since the Scopes trial in Tennessee, schools have taught the evolutionary scenario. And yet, recent polls have shown that about half the U.S. population still is not convinced. This lecture will suggest that they may be right to reject Darwin after all. Suppose we start with some of the account of creation that is at issue. Genesis chapter 1 tells us, quote, "And God said, 'Let the waters teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky.' So God created the great creatures of the sea, and every living and moving thing with which the water teems, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God made the wild animals according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good." Genesis 1, 20 through 21 and 25. That repeated phrase, "according to their kinds," is the sticking point for evolution. All of life had a common origin, we're told. Here's a standard dictionary definition of the word. Evolution, noun. 1. Biology, a gradual change in the characteristics of a population of animals or plants over successive generations. Accounts for the origin of existing species from ancestors unlike them. 2. A gradual development, especially to a more complex form, for example, the evolution of modern art. And most of us have seen a tree like this one, with all plants and animals descended from the first life form. But before we delve into the specifics here, we should note that the word evolution has two meanings that are often confused. Here's an example. This little guy has entertained thousands, if not millions of us over the years, and this shows how he evolved from a few pixels and few colors to greater and greater sophistication with animation, shading, and 3D effects. That's meaning number 2, a gradual development, especially to a more complex form. But how did that development happen? Was it a natural growth process? Of course not. It took intelligent input from graphics designers and others. Or, check this, the evolution of the Apollo rocket over an 8-year period to the wonderfully complex device that put humans on the moon. How did that happen? Did somebody leave the initial model locked up in a warehouse for those years, marinating perhaps, until it became the version we recall? Of course not. It took the skills of a whole corps of engineers, mathematicians, and designers at NASA and elsewhere to produce that. So that second definition of evolution is a bit misleading. It takes intelligent human input to improve the efficiency and sophistication of any device. Okay, fine. But the first definition is fundamentally different, right? No intelligence was involved in the development of living forms from the simplest protozoa to, say, Bill Gates or Yo-Yo Ma. We had better give biological evolution a close look. The definition says evolution involves a gradual change over successive generations. That means that any change in one generation would have to be passed on to the next, and that requires that the change appear in the DNA. So, what changes DNA? We're told that one source is selection. Notice this chart illustrating differences in kinds of living creatures. Natural selection has produced what are called races in humankind. For example, humans who lived in higher latitudes, like Sweden, would find that the scarcity of sunlight would be more of a problem for persons with darker skin, because they could absorb less of the needed vitamin D from it. Over several generations, then, their poorer health would gradually thin them out of the population, leaving the light-skinned Nordic type predominating. The opposite would occur in tropical regions. The different types of frogs we see are also the result of natural selection. The natural richness of DNA allows for variations in humans or frogs, and those variations can favor some types for survival in specific environments. The process is a bit easier to see with artificial selection. By choosing horses with specific traits we wanted for mating, we have produced horses for work or for racing. Their DNA contained the potential for such variation, and we exploited it. Similarly, we have produced over 400 breeds of dogs, all descended from an original wolf type. Evolutionary theory tells us that this process has no limits. Gradual changes can give us tigers from tadpoles. But can it? Here is a clip.
There are many different varieties of horses we can get through breeding, but they're still just horses. We can get large ones, small ones, even ones with 3 toes. Evolutionists put these into sort of a sequence and add a fossil rock badger at the bottom and then claim that's evidence for evolution. But you take out the fossil rock badger and you just have variation within a kind. Horses breed horses. That's not evolution.
No, natural selection, or even artificial selection, can't produce unlimited variations. We have several breeds of horses, but could even artificial selection produce a Pegasus? I'd love to see one, and perhaps you would too. But the bad news is that the potential variation in equine DNA doesn't contain material for making wings. Too bad. And too bad for natural selection as a mechanism for evolution. It can only provide variety within a kind. Horses or dogs, no in-between critters. Still, evolution has another mechanism, mutation. Radiation, copying damage, and more can produce changes in DNA. But here is what a biologist, Dr. Gary Parker, says about that. We have abundant evidence that various kinds of radiations, errors in DNA replication, and certain chemicals can indeed produce mutations, and mutations in reproductive cells can be passed on to future generations. Figure 16, that's at the upper left there, shows some of the changes that have been brought about in fruit fly wings because of mutations. Shorter wings, very short wings, curled wings, spread apart wings, miniature wings, wings without cross veins. Students in my genetics classes work with these fruit flies each year, crossing different ones and working out inheritance patterns." End quote. But the key fact here is that after hundreds of generations of fruit flies in the lab, they're still all fruit flies, just deformed ones. And Dr. Lynn Margulis adds a relevant footnote here. Mutations, in summary, tend to induce sickness, death, or deficiencies. That's from her book, Acquiring Genomes, A Theory of the Origins of the Species. No, mutation can't manage evolution either. Well, if neither natural selection nor mutation can accomplish what evolution requires, it becomes clear what is needed to produce nature's buffet: new, coherent information. Just as with the evolution of Mario or the Apollo spacecraft, intelligence has to intervene and tell how to make a wing, how to grow hair, salamanders might like some, how to make a special stomach. Cows have one with 4 parts, you know. How to make an external ear. Pity the frog who doesn't have one. How to do echolocation. How to produce a smell. Or how to learn the violin. New, coherent information. Can the natural evolutionary processes produce that? Let's ask one of the most famous proponents of evolutionary theory today, Dr. Richard Dawkins. An Oxford PhD, he is the author of several books on this subject, like The Blind Watchmaker and The God Delusion and Outgrowing God. A journalist interviewed him at his home some years ago and asked him this crucial question: can any evolutionary process make new coherent information? Here we see the question and answer.
Professor Dawkins, can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome?
That was his answer. Now, we saw Professor Dawkins speechless for 11 seconds. We shortened it. The actual time was 19 seconds. An eternity for him, no doubt. When I first saw this video, I wondered whether it might have been unfair to Dawkins. So I dug deeper into the episode. This quote comes from Glenn Morton, who is himself an evolutionist. He had contacted Gillian Brown, producer of the video, and asked to hear the whole tape. She sent him the unedited raw version. Quote, I played the audio along with the video, and the intake of air that Dawkins took during the 19 seconds of silence was also on the audio. So, assuming no doctoring of the audio tape, Dawkins was stumped. I emailed Dawkins on Saturday, June 6th, 1998, asking if he had gotten the tape and viewed it. I also thought I had sent him one in early July, but also didn't get a response. But when I publicly stated that Jillian Brown's tape seemed to support her case, Dawkins contacted me and told me that he now recalled the event and that the pause had been made while he considered whether or not to throw them out of his house for having obtained an interview under false pretenses. Frankly, I have a better memory than Dawkins. If someone did that to me, I would remember it easily. That's Glenn R. Morton. And Mr. Morton had this to say in conclusion, quote, I will state categorically that the audio tape of the interview 100% supports Jillian Brown's contention that Dawkins couldn't answer the question. Did you follow that? Perhaps the most famous and prolific evolutionary spokesman of our day could not answer the fundamental question of how DNA can acquire new information, nor could he give an example of a case where it had. And a well-known evolutionary colleague of his agreed that he could not. An impartial observer might well say, game, set, and match. The issues are pretty basic then. Evolution not only needs vast stretches of time, which we obviously cannot duplicate in the lab to test that element, but it also needs a mechanism to produce the astonishing variety of living things that inhabit our world. It needs something to modify DNA, and modify it without any limits. Evolutionists can't come up with a mechanism for true evolutionary change, not natural selection, not mutation, nor can they point to an example of that kind of change. So we are left with a world where amoebas are amoebas, fish are fish, birds are birds, whales are whales, dogs are dogs, horses are horses, people are people, just as the designer made them. If you have questions about this lecture, or any of the others in the Good Answers series, you may direct them to me, Dr. Jerry C. Four, at yahoo.com.